The kitchen at Luca's breathed in a rhythm all its own, a living thing of hissing gas burners and the percussive crack of knives against cutting boards, of steam rising from copper pots like ghosts escaping through the exhaust hoods that lined the ceiling in rows of brushed steel. It was 10 minutes past 9 on a Thursday evening in November, and the dining room beyond the swinging double doors hummed with the kind of restrained conversation that only money could buy. Voices held low, not out of politeness but out of the practiced awareness that in certain rooms, walls had ears and ears had owners. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of a converted textile warehouse on the west side of the city, a building whose brick facade still bore the faded painted letters of a company that had ceased to exist 40 years ago, and its interior had been gutted and rebuilt into something that magazines described as industrial elegance, but which, to the people who actually worked there, felt more like a beautiful cage d'Ice. The lighting was warm but precise, each table illuminated by a single pendant lamp that cast a pool of amber over white linen, and left the spaces between tables in deliberate shadow, so that each party existed in its own private island of light, surrounded by a sea of agreeable darkness. The floors were poured concrete, sealed to a matte finish that absorbed the sound of footsteps and gave the room the acoustic quality of a library, which was appropriate, because the people who dined at Luca's understood that silence was a currency and they spent it carefully. In the kitchen, that silence did not exist. Here, the world was noise and heat and motion, a choreography of 12 bodies moving through a space designed for 8, each one navigating the others with the unconscious precision of birds in a murmuration. The head chef, a man named Giordano whose forearms were mapped with burn scars and whose voice could cut through the roar of a convection oven at full blast, stood at the pass, the long steel counter where finished plates were assembled and inspected before being sent through the doors. He stood with his back straight and his hands flat on the counter's edge, and he was not moving, which meant something was wrong. When Giordano was still, the kitchen held its breath. When Giordano was still, it meant a plate had come back. The plate sat on the pass in front of him like an accusation. Branzino, pan-seared, skin crisped to a shade of gold that bordered on bronze, laid across a bed of fennel puree with a scatter of capers, and a thread of lemon oil drawn in a single clean line across the rim. It was, by any objective measure, a flawless plate. The fish had been cooked to the precise moment where the flesh separated into clean, moist flakes at the touch of a fork. The fennel puree was silk. The capers had been fried until they bloomed open like tiny dark flowers, and it had been sent back, not with a complaint, not with an explanation. The server, a young woman named Daria, whose composure was legendary among the front-of-house staff, had returned through the swinging doors carrying the plate with both hands and placed it on the pass, and said only 2 words. Table 12. And everyone in the kitchen knew what that meant, because Table 12 was not a table. Table 12 was a verdict. Table 12 sat in the far corner of the dining room, positioned against the exposed brick wall beneath a single pendant lamp that had been adjusted, on the first night its occupant had dined there, to hang exactly 4 inches higher than the others, because the man who sat at Table 12 did not like light falling directly on his face. No one had asked him to articulate this preference. The maitre d', a man named Soren, who had spent 19 years reading the unspoken demands of powerful men, had simply observed the way the guest's jaw tightened on that first evening, the way his eyes narrowed by a fraction when the lamp swung slightly in the draft from the door, and had called an electrician the following morning. The adjustment was made. The guest never mentioned it. He never needed to. That was the nature of his authority. It operated below the frequency of language, in the subsonic register where true power lived, and the people around him responded to it the way the sea responds to the pull of the moon, not because they chose to, but because they could not help it. His name was not spoken in the kitchen. He was referred to only as Table 12, or, among the older staff who had been at Luca's long enough to understand the full architecture of the city's shadow economy, as him. He came on Thursdays. Always Thursdays. He arrived between 8:45 and 9, accompanied by 2 men who sat at the adjacent table and ordered nothing, and watched the room with the flat, patient attention of surveillance cameras. He wore dark suits, always dark, the fabric so fine that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and his shirts were white or pale gray and buttoned to the collar without a tie. His hands were large and still, resting on the table, or holding a glass of wine with a grip that was neither delicate nor forceful, but simply exact, the way a man holds something he understands completely. His face was constructed from angles, a jaw that could have been cut from granite, cheekbones that cast their own shadows, and eyes that were so dark they appeared black in the restaurant's amber light. Eyes that moved slowly across whatever they observed, and missed nothing and gave nothing back. He was perhaps 45. He was perhaps older. It was impossible to tell because his face did not carry the usual markers of age, the softness, the loosening, the gradual surrender to gravity. His face was a fortification. It had been built to withstand siege. He had been dining at Luca's every Thursday for 11 months, and in that time he had sent back 14 plates. Not 14 meals. 14 individual plates across 11 months of weekly visits. The frequency was not high enough to be interpreted as cruelty, and not low enough to be dismissed as ordinary dissatisfaction. It was, the kitchen staff had come to understand, a form of communication. Each returned plate carried a message, though the message was never spoken and never written on the plate itself. Sometimes the message was about temperature. Sometimes it was about seasoning. Once, and this had become a story that the line cooks told new hires in hushed, almost reverential tones, he had sent back a risotto because the rice had been stirred 6 times too many, and when Giordano had tasted it himself, furious, ready to dismiss the complaint as the caprice of a man who enjoyed his own power, he had tasted it and gone quiet and stood very still and then, without a word, scraped the entire pot into the waste bin and started again. Tonight the branzino had come back without explanation. Daria had not been given a reason. The man at table 12 had simply looked at the plate, looked at the fish, and then looked at Daria with those lightless eyes, and she had understood. She had lifted the plate and carried it back, and placed it on the pass, and said, "Table 12." And now Giordano was standing very still, and the kitchen was holding its breath. It was into this silence that the girl walked. She came through the back entrance, the service door that opened onto the alley where the delivery trucks unloaded, and where, at this hour, the only illumination came from a single caged bulb mounted above the door frame that cast a circle of yellowish light onto the wet asphalt. She was 23 years old, though she could have passed for younger, not because of any softness in her features, but because of a quality of stillness that she carried, a containment that in older people reads as composure, but in the young reads as something else entirely, something closer to the particular silence of a person who has learned very early that the world is not safe and has arranged themselves accordingly. She was small, 5'3" at most, with dark hair pulled back into a knot so tight it looked painful, and hands that were red and rough and nicked with the small white scars that come not from accidents, but from repetition, from 10,000 hours of knife work performed with the kind of intensity that occasionally costs skin. She wore checked trousers and a white jacket that was too large for her and had been rolled at the cuffs to free her hands, and the jacket bore no name, no embroidery, no insignia of rank, because she had no rank. She was the newest member of the kitchen, hired 3 weeks ago to replace a prep cook who had quit after his 3rd encounter with a returned plate from table 12, and she had been assigned to the station farthest from the pass, the cold station, where she prepared salads and garnishes and the small, invisible components that no diner ever noticed, but that Giordano inspected with the same ferocity he brought to the main courses. Her name was Elena Vasile, and she had not spoken more than 40 words to anyone in the kitchen since her arrival. She entered through the back door and hung her coat on the hook and washed her hands at the designated sink, scrubbing for exactly 30 seconds with the methodical thoroughness that the health code required, and that almost no one actually performed, and she dried her hands on a clean towel, and folded the towel, and placed it in the laundry bin, and walked to her station and began to work. She did not look at the pass. She did not look at Giordano. She did not look at the plate of branzino that sat there like an unexploded device. She simply began to prep, her knife moving through a bundle of chives with a sound like a whispered conversation. rapid and precise and so quiet that it barely registered beneath the ambient noise of the kitchen. Giordano looked at the plate. He looked at the dining room doors. He looked at the clock on the wall above the dishwashing station, which read 9:17. And then he did something that no one in the kitchen had ever seen him do. He picked up the plate and carried it to the waste bin and scraped the fish into the garbage and set the empty plate in the dish pit, and turned to the line and said, in a voice that was not loud, but carried the density of a closed fist, "Someone is going to cook this man a fish, and it is not going to come back." The line cooks looked at each other. The saucier, a man named Tomasz, who had worked at Luca's for 6 years and had twice been offered positions at restaurants with Michelin stars and had twice declined because the money at Luca's was better and the questions were fewer, stepped forward and said he would do it. He began to prep a new piece of branzino, selecting the fillet himself from the walk-in cooler, running his fingers along the flesh to check for pin bones, patting it dry with paper towels, scoring the skin with 3 precise diagonal cuts. He seasoned it. He heated the pan. He cooked it with the concentration of a man diffusing a bomb, adjusting the flame, tilting the pan, basting with brown butter, checking the internal temperature with a probe thermometer that he trusted more than his own instincts. He plated it. He wiped the rim. He placed it on the pass. Giordano inspected it. He nodded. Daria carried it through the doors. 4 minutes later, Daria returned. She was carrying the plate. She placed it on the pass. "Table 12, she said. Her voice was steady, but there was something in her eyes that had not been there before. A tightness. A flicker of something that, in a less composed person, might have been called fear. Giordano stared at the plate. The branzino was untouched. Not a single flake had been displaced. The lemon oil line was unbroken. The man at table 12 had not even picked up his fork. The kitchen went silent in a way that was different from before. Before, the silence had been anticipatory, the indrawn breath before a storm. Now it was something else. It was the silence of a room that has been weighed and found wanting, and every person in it knew it, felt it in the base of their spine like the first tremor of a quake that has not yet arrived but is coming, is already traveling through the bedrock beneath their feet. It was Elena who moved first. She did not speak. She did not raise her hand or clear her throat or ask permission. She simply set down her knife, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked to the pass. She walked past Tomasz, who was standing with his arms at his sides and his jaw clenched so tight that a vein had risen in his temple like a fault line. She walked past the grill station, past the sauce station, past the expediting area where the tickets hung in their metal clips like prayer flags, and she stopped in front of Giordano and looked at the plate, and then looked at him. Giordano looked at her. For 3 weeks he had barely registered her existence. She was a prep cook. She cut vegetables. She made vinaigrettes. She was furniture. But something in the way she stood there, the absolute stillness of her posture, the way her hands hung at her sides without fidgeting, without the nervous energy that young cooks radiated like heat from a poorly insulated oven, something in that stillness made him pause. "Let me try," she said. Her voice was quiet. It was not timid. There is a difference between quiet and timid that most people never learn to hear. But Giordano had spent 31 years in kitchens, and he heard it. He heard the difference. He heard that this girl was not asking. She was informing him. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. She moved to the fish station with the economy of someone who has navigated 100 kitchens, her body automatically adjusting to the unfamiliar layout, her hands finding tools by instinct rather than sight. She opened the walk-in cooler and selected a fillet herself, but she did not choose the largest or the most pristine. She chose a piece from the center of the fish, a section that included a slight irregularity in the flesh, a place where the muscle fibers changed direction, creating a texture that most cooks would have discarded or hidden. She carried it back to the station and laid it on the cutting board, and stood very still, looking at it, her head tilted slightly to one side, the way a painter looks at a canvas before making the first mark. She stood like that for 8 seconds. In a professional kitchen during service, 8 seconds of inactivity is an eternity. It is an act of either incompetence or supreme confidence, and the kitchen watched her and could not decide which. Then she began. She did not score the skin. She pressed her palm flat against the flesh and held it there for a moment, feeling the temperature, the moisture content, the subtle resistance of the collagen beneath the surface. She heated a carbon steel pan, not the stainless steel that Tomasz had used, and she heated it dry, without oil, bringing it to a temperature that she judged not by a thermometer, but by holding her hand 6 inches above the surface, reading the heat the way a blind person reads Braille. When the pan reached the temperature she wanted, she added oil, not olive oil, but grapeseed, a thin film that shimmered and went transparent almost instantly. She laid the fish in the pan skin side down and pressed it flat with her spatula for exactly 3 seconds, establishing contact between the skin and the metal, and then she removed the pressure and did not touch it again. She stood with her hands at her sides and watched. She listened. The sound of the fish in the pan was a language she understood, a continuous narration of what was happening at the molecular level, the Maillard reaction progressing through its stages, the proteins denaturing, the moisture converting to steam, the sugars caramelizing. She listened to it the way a mother listens to a child's breathing in the dark, alert to every variation, every shift in pitch or tempo. When she flipped the fish, it was with a single motion of the wrist that was so fluid, it looked like a magic trick, the fillet turning in the air and landing flesh side down with a sound like a whispered secret. She cooked the second side for less than 40 seconds. She removed the fish from the pan and laid it on a clean plate, and the plate she chose was not the standard white porcelain that Lucas used, but a darker one, a slate gray plate that she found on a shelf above the dessert station, a plate that had never been used for a main course, and she placed it there with the same quiet authority with which she did everything. The fennel puree she made from scratch, not from the batch that had been prepared during the afternoon mise en place. From scratch. She cut a fresh fennel bulb, removing the outer layer and the core with cuts so precise they could have been made by a machine, and she sweated the fennel in butter over low heat until it was translucent and fragrant, and she added a splash of Pernod that flared blue for an instant before dying, and she pured it in a small blender and passed it through a fine sieve, and adjusted the seasoning with white pepper and a squeeze of lemon so small it was more a gesture than a measurement, and she spread the puree on the plate, not in the traditional oval, but in a single curved line, an arc, a shape that suggested motion, flight, the trajectory of something rising. She placed the fish on the puree. She added the capers, but she had done something to them that no one in the kitchen could identify at first, something that made them darker and more fragrant, and it was only later, when Tomasz examined the station after she had finished, that he found the jar of aged sherry vinegar she had used to deglaze the caper pan, a jar from the back of the pantry shelf that had been there for 2 years, and that no one had touched because aged sherry vinegar cost more per ounce than the wine they served by the glass. She finished the plate with a drizzle of oil, but not lemon oil. Something else. Something golden green and herbaceous that she had made by crushing fresh basil leaves into the oil with her fingers, bruising the herbs to release their volatile compounds, and the scent that rose from the plate was so immediate and so alive that it stopped Giordano mid-breath. She placed the plate on the pass. She did not wipe the rim because the rim was already clean. She had not spilled a single drop. Giordano looked at the plate. He did not taste it. He did not inspect it with the forensic intensity he brought to every other dish that left his kitchen. He simply looked at it, and something in his face changed. Something subtle, a relaxation of the muscles around his eyes that was not a smile, but was perhaps the place where a smile would have been if Giordano were a man who smiled during service. "Send it," he said. Daria carried the plate through the doors. The kitchen resumed its noise, its motion, its mechanical rhythm. But there was an undercurrent now, a tension that was not the productive tension of a busy service, but the suspended, breathless tension of a room waiting for a detonation. Cooks exchanged glances. The dishwasher, a kid named Marco, who was 17 and worked the closing shift because it paid an extra €2 an hour and he was saving for a motorcycle, stood with his hands dripping at his sides and watched the swinging doors with an expression of undisguised fascination. Elena returned to her station. She picked up her knife. She resumed cutting chives. The sound of the blade against the cutting board was the only sound in her immediate vicinity. A soft, rhythmic whisper that seemed to exist in its own pocket of calm within the storm of the kitchen. She did not watch the doors. 7 minutes passed. Daria did not return. 8 minutes. 9. In a restaurant kitchen, the absence of a returned plate is not celebrated. It is merely the absence of a problem, a negative space, a thing that did not happen. But tonight, with 2 consecutive returns from table 12 already marking the evening like scars, the absence of a third return was not nothing. It was something. It was a held breath that was slowly, cautiously, being released. At 9:41, Daria came back through the doors. She was not carrying a plate. She was carrying a message. She walked directly to Giordano and spoke to him in a voice so low that only he could hear, and whatever she said caused him to look up from the pass and turn his head toward Elena's station at the far end of the kitchen, and the expression on his face was one that his staff had never seen before and could not have named if they had. It was not surprise. Giordano did not do surprise. It was something closer to recognition, the look of a man who has just understood something that he should have understood earlier. He walked to Elena's station. The kitchen parted for him the way it always did, bodies shifting instinctively to clear his path, because Giordano in motion was a force that demanded clearance. He stopped in front of her cutting board and looked down at the chives she was slicing, each piece exactly 2 millimeters in length, uniform as machine-cut components, and he said, "Table 12 would like to speak to the cook who prepared his fish." Elena's knife did not pause. She finished the chive she was cutting, set the knife down parallel to the edge of the board, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked up at him. Her face was unreadable. Her eyes were dark and steady, and held something that Giordano, in his 31 years of reading the faces of cooks under pressure, could not quite identify. It was not fear. It was not pride. It was something older than both, something that lived deeper in the architecture of a person, in the foundation rather than the walls. She walked through the swinging doors and into the dining room. The transition was immediate and total. The kitchen's heat and noise fell away behind her like a wave breaking against a seawall, and she stepped into the dining room's constructed calm. The amber light, the murmured conversations, the subtle clink of crystal and silver, the smell of good wine and expensive perfume, and the indefinable scent of money at rest. She walked between the tables, her white jacket too large and her checked trousers creased from hours of standing, and her hair escaping its knot in small dark wisps at her temples, and she was aware, in the peripheral, observational way that had become her default mode of processing the world, that the diners at the tables she passed glanced up at her and then looked away, because a cook walking through a dining room is an anomaly, a creature from behind the curtain suddenly visible on the stage, and the audience does not know how to respond. Table 12 was ahead. The 2 men at the adjacent table saw her first. They tracked her approach with identical expressions of flat assessment, their eyes moving from her face to her hands to her posture, performing the rapid threat evaluation that was not conscious but reflexive, wired into them through years of operating in a world where the distance between safety and catastrophe was measured in seconds and inches. She was not a threat. She was a girl in a too large jacket with chive stains on her cuffs. They dismissed her and returned to their watching. He was sitting with his back to the wall. His hands were on the table, one resting on either side of the plate she had prepared, and the plate was empty. Not politely empty, not the cultivated emptiness of a diner who has eaten enough to be courteous. Scraped empty. The fennel puree was gone. The capers were gone. The oil had been gathered with bread, and the bread was gone too, and the plate itself had the look of something that had been not merely eaten from, but consumed, used, honored. The lemon oil line she had drawn was a ghost on the gray surface, visible only as a faint sheen. He looked at her as she approached, and his eyes, those dark, assessing, lightless eyes, moved across her face with a slowness that was not indolence, but concentration. The way a jeweler examines a stone, turning it, looking for the flaw, the fracture, the inclusion that would reveal its true nature. She stopped 3 feet from the table. She did not sit down. She had not been invited to sit. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, not behind her back, not at her sides, but clasped at her waist in a posture that was neither submissive nor defiant, but simply present. A body occupying space with the quiet certainty of a person who knows exactly where they are and why. He did not speak immediately. The silence between them had weight, texture, the quality of something that could be held and examined. It lasted 4 seconds, which, in a silent dining room, under the gaze of a man whose silence was legendary, felt like an hour. "You cooked this," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low and unhurried, a baritone that did not project, but rather occupied the space immediately around him, a voice designed for rooms, not auditoriums, for conversations that no one else was meant to hear. "Yes," she said. He looked at the empty plate. He looked back at her. "The 2 previous cooks," he said. "The ones who prepared the earlier attempts tonight. They followed the recipe. You did not." She said nothing. She did not nod or shake her head. She simply stood and waited, and her stillness was so complete that it seemed to create a kind of gravity, a density of presence that made the ambient noise of the restaurant recede. "Why not?" he said. "Because the recipe was wrong for you," she said. Another silence. The man at table 12 tilted his head by a fraction of a degree, a movement so small it would have been invisible to anyone not watching with extreme attention. But Elena was watching with extreme attention, because she had been watching things with extreme attention since she was 9 years old, and her father had placed a knife in her hand and told her that the first skill of a cook is not cutting, but seeing, not tasting, but listening, not following a recipe, but reading the person who will eat the food. "You have been here 3 weeks," he said. "You are a prep cook. You cut vegetables." "Yes," she said. "And you believe you can read what a man wants from a plate of fish." "I believe I can read what a man needs," she said. "It is not always the same thing." He leaned back in his chair. The movement was small, a redistribution of weight, a settling, the way a large animal adjusts its position without urgency, because urgency is for creatures that can be threatened. His eyes had not left her face. They had not blinked. Elena was aware of this, and she was aware of her own heartbeat, which was elevated but controlled, a metronome set to a faster tempo, but still keeping time, still disciplined, still hers. "What is your name?" he said. "Elena." "Elena? What?" "Vasile." The name landed in the space between them, and something happened to his face, something that was not a change of expression, but a deepening of the expression that was already there, as if a photograph had suddenly gained an additional dimension, depth where there had been only surface. "Vasile," he repeated. The word sat in his mouth for a moment before he released it, and when he spoke it, it carried a weight that had not been there a second ago, the weight of recognition, of memory, of a connection being drawn between 2 points that should not have been connected. "There was a restaurant," he said slowly, "on the east side, 15 years ago. A man named Vasile, Romanian, cooked like he was trying to save someone's life with every plate." Elena's hands, clasped at her waist, tightened by a fraction. The knuckles whitened. It was the first visible crack in her composure, a hairline fracture in the wall she had built, and she closed it immediately, her fingers relaxing, her breathing steadying. But it had been there. He had seen it. A man like him saw everything. "My father," she said. The man at table 12 was quiet for a long time. The pendant lamp above his head cast its adjusted light onto his hands, which had not moved from their positions on either side of the empty plate, and his fingers, long and blunt-tipped and marked with the faint white lines of old scars that came from a life lived closer to violence than most people ever came, lay flat and still on the white linen. "Your father's restaurant closed," he said. "Yes, he lost everything. Yes, and you are here. Cutting vegetables. Yes." He studied her. the assessment was different now. Before, he had been looking at a cook. Now he was looking at something else, something that his particular vocabulary of power and loyalty and bloodline and honor and loss could accommodate, because those were the categories through which he understood the world. And this girl, this small, quiet, chive-stained girl standing in front of him, with her hands clasped and her spine straight and her father's ghost behind her eyes, fit into several of those categories at once. "Your father," he said. "What happened to him? The truth, not the story." Elena looked at him, and for the first time since she had walked through the dining room doors, her expression changed. It did not soften. It sharpened. The steadiness in her eyes condensed into something harder, something with edges. And when she spoke, her voice was the same quiet register it had always been. But the quiet was different now. The quiet of a blade being drawn rather than a blade at rest. "He was destroyed," she said. "Not by the market. Not by bad luck. By people who wanted his building and did not care that a man's life was inside it. They sent inspectors who found violations that did not exist. They sent lawyers who filed claims that had no merit. They made it impossible for him to get insurance, impossible to get deliveries, impossible to open his doors. It took them 14 months to dismantle everything he had spent 20 years building, and when it was done, when the locks were changed and the sign was taken down, he went home and sat at the kitchen table and did not get up for 3 days. On the 4th day, he went to the hospital. He came home 6 weeks later with a diagnosis and a timeline, and he spent the next 2 years teaching me everything he knew, not because he thought I would open a restaurant, but because he said that what he knew was not recipes. It was a way of seeing, and a way of seeing cannot be taken away by inspectors or lawyers or anyone else. It lives in the hands, it lives in the eyes, and it passes from one person to the next like a flame, and as long as the flame is passed, the thing itself survives, even if the building burns. She stopped. Her hands were still clasped. Her breathing was even. The crack that had appeared in her composure had not widened. It had sealed itself, repaired by the act of speaking, by the strange alchemy of giving words to a thing that had lived inside her as silence for years. The man at table 12 did not move. His face was stone. But something behind the stone had shifted, the way tectonic plates shift miles beneath the surface, invisible to the eye, but altering the landscape in ways that would only become apparent later, in the cracks that would appear in unexpected places, in the new contours that would emerge where the old ones had been. He said nothing for a long time. Then he lifted his hand and gestured, a small movement, barely more than the uncurling of 2 fingers, and the gesture brought one of the men from the adjacent table to his side with the silent, instantaneous obedience of a trained reflex. The man leaned down. Table 12 spoke to him in a voice too low for Elena to hear, words that were not in English, a language she did not recognize but whose cadence was heavy and deliberate, each syllable placed with the precision of a man who understood that language was architecture, and every word was a load-bearing wall. The man at the adjacent table straightened and looked at Elena, and then left the dining room through the front entrance, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone executing an order that had no deadline, but also no room for delay. Table 12 returned his attention to her. "Sit down," he said. She did not sit down. "I am working," she said. "My shift ends at midnight." Something moved across his face. It was not irritation. It was something else, something that in a different man might have been called amusement, but which in him looked more like the experience of encountering something unexpected, a variable that did not conform to the expected pattern, and the slight recalibration that followed, the adjustment of a mental model to accommodate new data. "Your shift," he said. The word carried a freight of irony that was not cruel, but was not kind either, an acknowledgement of the absurdity of the situation, of the distance between what she was doing and what she was capable of doing, a distance that he had measured in a single plate of fish, and that she had been living inside for 3 years, like a person occupying a room far too small for their body. Elena remained standing. "My father taught me that a cook does not leave the kitchen during service," she said. "Not for money, not for power, not for anyone. The kitchen is a promise." You do not break a promise because someone important asks you to. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was immense. It filled the space between them like water filling a vessel, rising to the level it needed to reach, finding its own surface, its own stillness. The man at table 12 looked at her, and the look lasted long enough that the two men at the adjacent table shifted slightly in their seats, an involuntary response to a situation they could not read because their training was for threats, for angles, for exits, and this was none of those things. This was something they had no protocol for. He nodded. It was a single motion, a descent and return of his chin that carried the weight of a signature on a contract, the weight of a door opening that could not be closed again. "Go back to your kitchen," he said. "Finish your shift. When you are done, there will be a car outside the service entrance. The driver will bring you to a place where we can speak without the smell of other people's food. You will come if you want to come. You will not come if you do not want to come. Either way, I will be there." Elena looked at him. She looked at the empty plate between his hands. She looked at the two men at the adjacent table who were watching her with an intensity that had shifted from dismissal to something more complicated, something that included a component of wariness, because they had seen their employer's face change, and when his face changed, the ground shifted beneath everyone's feet. She turned and walked back through the dining room. She passed between the islands of amber light, through the murmured conversations and the clink of crystal and the subtle perfume of money, and she pushed through the swinging doors and into the kitchen's heat and noise and light, and she walked to her station and picked up her knife and began to cut chives. The blade moved. 2 millimeters, 2 millimeters, 2 millimeters. Perfect. Giordano watched her from the pass. He did not ask what had happened. He did not need to. He had been in kitchens long enough to recognize the look on a person's face when they have walked through a door that exists in no physical building, a door between one life and the next, and are still standing, still cutting, still working, still keeping the promise. Service continued. The kitchen moved. The plates went out. None came back. At midnight, Elena removed her apron. She folded it with the same precision she applied to everything, each fold aligned with the one beneath it, the strings tucked in, the fabric squared. She hung it on the hook beside her station. She washed her hands. She retrieved her coat from the back entrance. She stepped out into the alley. The car was there, black, long, its engine running with a sound so quiet it was less a sound than a vibration. A pulse, something felt in the soles of her feet rather than heard with her ears. The driver stood beside the rear door, a man whose face was forgettable by design, whose suit was dark and whose posture communicated a single message: readiness. Elena stood in the alley. The caged bulb above the service door cast its yellow circle on the wet asphalt. The November air was cold against her face, carrying the smell of rain and exhaust and the distant metallic scent of the river. She stood there for 12 seconds, and in those 12 seconds she was aware of the weight of her father's knife roll in her bag. The set of 8 knives that he had given her on the last day he was strong enough to stand in a kitchen. Knives that she sharpened every Sunday morning with a whetstone and mineral oil in a ritual that was not maintenance, but prayer. And the weight of those knives was the weight of a question that she had been carrying since the day the locks were changed, and the sign came down, and her father sat at the kitchen table and did not get up. She got in the car. The drive took 22 minutes. The car moved through the city's late-night streets with the fluid authority of a vessel that had been granted passage, traffic parting, lights seeming to turn green at its approach, the city itself yielding to the momentum of the machine and the weight of the name attached to it. Elena sat in the back seat and watched the city pass through the tinted windows and said nothing. The leather seat was cold and smooth beneath her. The car smelled of leather and something else, something clean and dark and faintly botanical, a scent that she would later learn was the interior detailing compound, used exclusively by one company for one fleet of vehicles owned by one man. The city at midnight was a different organism than the city at noon, stripped of its daytime performance of productivity and commerce, reduced to its essential architecture, Its bones, the steel and glass and stone that remained when the people retreated behind their doors and left the streets to the taxis and the delivery trucks and the few solitary figures who moved through the pools of streetlight with the hunched, purposeful gait of people who had somewhere to be, and no interest in being seen getting there. Elena watched it all with the detached attention she brought to everything, cataloging without judging, observing without narrating, and somewhere in the silence of the car's interior, she became aware of her own reflection in the tinted glass, a ghost image superimposed on the passing city, a girl in a white jacket with tired eyes, and her father's hands. The car stopped in front of a building that Elena recognized. She recognized it because every person in the city who had ever been connected, however tangentially, to the food industry recognized it. It was the Aris, a restaurant that had closed 7 years ago after its owner, a Greek-born chef named Dimitri Papadimitriou, had suffered a stroke at the age of 61 and had never returned. The Aris had been, for the 17 years of its existence, the finest restaurant in the city. Not the most expensive, not the most fashionable, the finest. A distinction that Dimitri himself had drawn in the single interview he had ever given, saying that expense is a decision and fashion is a disease, but fineness is a discipline, and you either have it or you do not, and if you do not, no amount of money or attention will create it. The building was dark. The windows were covered with paper from the inside, the way buildings are covered when they are being renovated or demolished, and the facade was unchanged from the photographs that Elena had studied. The limestone, the iron railings, the door with its brass handle worn smooth by 17 years of hands. The driver opened her door. She stepped out. The air here was different from the alley behind Luca's, cleaner, colder, carrying the scent of the park across the street. Dormant grass and bare trees and the mineral smell of stone fountains drained for winter. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the building and felt something move inside her chest. A tightening, a contraction of something that was not quite grief and not quite hope, but occupied the territory between them. The door opened, not from inside. One of the men from the adjacent table, the one who had been sent away earlier, stood in the doorway. He held the door and did not speak and did not gesture, because the gesture was the open door itself, and Elena walked through it. Inside, the Aris was not empty. It was waiting. The paper had been removed from the windows on the inside, revealing the dining room in its original state. The plaster walls painted a shade of cream that had deepened with age to the color of old parchment. The wooden floors that bore the scars of 17 years of service. The brass light fixtures that hung from chains and cast circles of warm light that overlapped and merged into a continuous glow. The tables were gone except for one, a round table in the center of the room set with a white cloth, and 2 chairs and a single candle that burned with a flame so steady it seemed painted rather than alive. He was sitting at the table. He had changed from his dark suit into a different dark suit, this one slightly less formal, the jacket unbuttoned, the collar of his shirt open by one button, revealing the base of his throat, which was tanned and corded with the tendons of a man who carried tension in his body, the way a cable carries current, invisibly but constantly. He was holding a glass of red wine, and on the table in front of him was a bottle and a second glass, empty, waiting. Elena stopped inside the door. She looked at the room. She looked at the table. She looked at the candle, the wine, the empty glass. She looked at him. This was Dimitri's place, she said. Yes, you own it. I have owned it for 3 years. Why? He set down his glass. The wine inside it caught the candlelight and held it, a deep ruby glow that seemed to pulse with its own inner illumination. And he looked at the glass, and then at her. And when he spoke, his voice was different than it had been in the restaurant. Lower, slower, stripped of the formal cadence of a man speaking in public, replaced by something raw, something that sounded like the voice of a man speaking in a room where he did not need to perform. Because Dimitri Papadimitriou was the only man in this city who ever cooked a meal that made me feel something, he said. And when he could no longer cook, I bought the building so that no one else could turn it into a bank, or a boutique hotel, or a place that sold small plates of food arranged to look like paintings, and tasted like nothing. I bought it because some things should not be allowed to disappear simply because the person who made them is gone. Elena felt the words land. They landed in the place where her father's voice lived, in the deep architecture of memory where certain phrases are stored not as language, but as sensation, as physical imprints in the body. And the sensation they produced was so specific and so acute that she had to close her eyes for a moment. Just a moment. A blink that lasted 1 second longer than a blink should last, and when she opened her eyes again, they were brighter but not wet, because Elena Vasily did not cry. She had not cried since the day the sign came down. She had decided, in the quiet, methodical way she decided everything, that the tears were a luxury she could not afford, and she had locked them away in a room inside herself, and sealed the door and lost the key deliberately. And now, standing in Dmitri Papadimitrio's restaurant looking at a man whose name she still did not know, she felt the door rattle but held. He poured wine into the second glass and set it on her side of the table and said, "Sit." And this time she sat. He told her what he wanted. He told her in the same way he did everything, with economy, precision, and the absolute certainty of a man who has never in his adult life doubted his own judgment. He wanted to reopen the Aris. Not as it had been, not as a replica of Dmitri's vision, as something new, something that honored the building's history while creating its own. He had been looking for someone to run the kitchen for 3 years. He had auditioned 14 chefs. Some were famous, some were brilliant. All of them had cooked him food that was technically flawless and emotionally vacant. They cooked to impress. They cooked to perform. They cooked the way people write speeches, assembling correct words in the correct order to produce the correct effect, and the result was food that tasted exactly right and meant absolutely nothing. "Tonight," he said, "you cooked me a plate of fish. It was not the best fish I have ever eaten. It was not the most technically accomplished, but it was the first plate of food in 3 years that I have finished, because it was not cooked for my approval. It was cooked for me." Elena held the wine glass, but did not drink. The candle between them was still burning with that impossible steadiness, and the light it cast made the planes of his face both sharper and softer, the angles more pronounced, but the shadows warmer, and she saw in that light something she had not seen in the restaurant, had not been able to see under the amber pendant lamp. She saw fatigue, not physical tiredness, but the deeper exhaustion of a man who has spent decades maintaining a perimeter of control so absolute that it has become a prison. A man who sits alone at table 12 every Thursday, not because he loves the food, but because the ritual of dining alone in a room full of people who fear him is the closest thing to normalcy his life allows. "I am a prep cook," she said. "I have been out of a real kitchen for 3 years. I do not have a reputation. I do not have a team. I do not have the money to fail." He lifted his glass and drank. He set it down. The sound it made against the table was the smallest possible sound, a click, a punctuation mark in the conversation's grammar. "You have the one thing that none of the 14 chefs had," he said. "You have the fire." She looked at him. "The fire," she repeated. He leaned forward. The movement brought him closer to the candle, closer to her, and the space between them contracted, not physically, but in some other dimension, the dimension in which 2 people who have both built walls recognize the architecture of each other's fortifications and understand, with a mutual clarity that is rare and unsettling, that the walls were built from the same materials, and for the same reasons. "Your father lost everything," he said. "The building, the restaurant, the name, the work, everything except what he gave you. And what he gave you is the thing that no one can take, the thing that survives fire and theft and litigation and grief. I know this because I am a man who takes things. I have spent my life in a world where taking is the primary transaction, and I have learned that there are things that cannot be taken. They can only be given, and they can only be received by someone who understands what they are." He paused. The candle flame held its line. "You cooked that fish tonight the way your father would have cooked it. Not the technique, the intention. You cooked it for a stranger because you saw that the stranger was hungry, not for food, but for the thing that food can carry when it is made by someone who means it. That is the fire. It is not skill. Skill can be taught. It is not passion. Passion burns out. It is the discipline of caring, day after day, plate after plate, even when no one is watching, even when you are cutting chives at the worst station in a kitchen that does not know your name. Elena set down the glass. She had still not drunk from it. The wine inside caught the light and held it, and she looked at it, at the deep color, the slow legs running down the inside of the glass, the tiny imperfections in the crystal that refracted the candlelight into hairline spectrums of color, and she was aware that her hands were trembling. Not visibly, not in a way that anyone would notice, but she felt it, a vibration in the tendons, a micro-frequency of response that her body was producing independently of her will, and she recognized it for what it was. It was the sensation of something beginning. "My father used to say," she said quietly, "that a meal is not food. It is a conversation between the cook and the person who eats. And the best meals are the ones where both people are honest." She looked up from the glass. She looked at him. She held his gaze, and it was like holding something heavy, something with mass and density, and the specific gravity of a life lived in the territory between power and solitude. And she held it without flinching, and without performing the act of holding it, because performance was not in her vocabulary, not anymore. Not since the day she had stood in an empty restaurant and watched workmen remove the letters of her father's name from the window, one by one. "If I do this," she said, "I do it my way. My kitchen, my menu, my standards. I will not cook to impress your associates. I will not cook to intimidate your rivals. I will not cook to perform." She paused. The room was silent. The candle burned. "I will cook," she said, "the way my father taught me to cook. As if every plate is a conversation. As if every person who sits down at that table deserves to be told the truth. Even you. The man whose name she did not yet know. The man who controlled territories and commanded loyalties, and moved through the world like a force of nature that had chosen, for reasons known only to itself, to take the shape of a man in a dark suit, looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. And then something happened that the men at the adjacent table, had they been present, would not have believed. His mouth moved. The corners lifted. The stone of his face cracked, not with weakness, but with something that was the opposite of weakness, with the specific, rare courage required to allow another person to see behind the fortification, behind the siege wall, behind the architecture of control, to the human thing that lived inside. He smiled. It was not a large smile. It was barely visible. But it changed the geometry of his entire face, the way a single line drawn on a blank canvas changes the meaning of the space around it. And in that moment, Elena understood something that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, a truth that her father had tried to teach her, but that she could only learn through experience. The truth that the most powerful thing a person can do is not to build walls or command armies or accumulate empires. It is to sit across from another person and eat what they have made and let it reach them. The candle burned. The wine waited. The building that Dmitri Papadimitriou had filled with 17 years of intention and discipline and fire stood around them like a cathedral of someone else's faith, waiting to be filled with new prayers. Elena picked up the glass. She drank. 6 months later, the Arras reopened. The food critics described it in language that strained against its own adjectives, reaching for words that could capture what it felt like to eat there. The sensation of being addressed, of being seen, of sitting down as a stranger and standing up as a person who had been told something true by someone who had no reason to lie. The kitchen ran with a precision that veteran food writers compared to a Swiss watch, though this metaphor was inadequate because Swiss watches are cold, and the kitchen at the Orris was warm, a living system, a body, a heartbeat. Elena ran it from the pass. She stood where Giordano had stood, where Dmitri had stood before that, and she ran it in her own way, which was quiet and absolute, and governed by a single principle that she had written on a piece of paper and taped to the wall above the pass in handwriting that was small and precise and unhesitating. The paper said, "Every plate is a conversation. Tell the truth." The man who sat at the corner table on Thursday evenings, The man who had once been table 12, who still wore dark suits and still arrived accompanied by 2 men who watched the room with flat, patient eyes, ordered from the menu like any other guest. He did not send plates back. He did not need to. Because the cook who prepared his food knew him, knew what he needed rather than what he wanted, and the difference between those 2 things, which is the difference between skill and fire, between performance and truth, between a recipe followed and a conversation had, was the difference that her father had spent his last 2 years teaching her, and that she had carried through grief and debt and exile, and the worst station in a kitchen that did not know her name, and had set down, finally, on a gray plate in a restaurant where silence was currency, for a man who had forgotten what it meant to be fed. Some fires cannot be extinguished. They can only be passed from one pair of hands to the next, and what they illuminate is not the darkness around them but the people who carry them, the ones who keep cutting, keep cooking, keep telling the truth, plate after plate after plate, in the unshakable faith that somewhere, at some table, someone is hungry enough to listen.